So this video we're looking at the event system in CakePHP. You may have interacted with this event system inside callbacks within maybe table classes or controller callbacks. So here we're seeing the callbacks available within a table class. So let's have a look at using those callbacks within a CakePHP to do transformations or actions depending on what event has happened. So here we have in our application just a baked articles table object, and we're going to look at making a transformation using a method, one of the callback methods called public function, and it's the beforeSave. Now right at this moment there's no auto completion available, so let's enable that firstly. And if you go into your composer JSON on a fresh CakePHP project, you will find that in the suggest key there's this ide-helper. If you want to install that, you can just go composer require, say you want it to be put in the dev section, and then just run this command like this. But of course I've already got it installed here in the required dev section. Now in order for that to be of use to you, you need to make sure that it's loaded, and at the moment I haven't got it loaded. So how do I know what name this particular plugin is using? Go into your vendor directory, right down to CakePHP plugins .php, and you'll notice that all the different CakePHP plugins and their names are listed here. So just copy ide-helper, go to your src application file. Now we're going to put this into the CLI section, and the way we can do it is I'm just going to copy this optional plugin here, and this is good, this add optional plugin, because when you go into production and you don't install the ide-helper, this won't cause an exception and stop the application loading if the ide-helper is missing. So if we now look at our loaded plugins, we can see ide-helper is listed. Now how do we get this plugin helper to give us the completion that we want for our callback methods? If we just enter bin cake and have a look at our ide-helper commands that are available, we've got one here called code completion. So we can say bin cake code completion, and the subcommand is generate. Now what that does, if we have a look at our temp directory, it creates a number of different files which give us, for our controllers, the callback methods based on events, and we've got one here for our table classes as well, so you can see that all the different callback methods are available there for us. So now what the IDE will have done is open up all these files and make a list of auto-completed methods. So if I now uncomment this and type in before, I can now auto-complete my callback definition. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look inside the entity that we're posting from our web form, and we're going to ask the question, is this a new entity? And if it's a new entity, we're going to do a transformation on it. Now at the moment when I type in entity, I'm not getting any auto completion. I know that this article has a title, so what I can do again is just specify that this particular variable of entity is an article entity, and then we can get our autocomplete from the editor. Now we're going to do a simple transformation here. which is, if it's a new entity, just uppercase the title. Now let's look at that in action. So I'm going to create a new article here. And when we submit, obviously it uppercases it, but because we're using the isNew method, when we're doing an update, we can see that it doesn't perform that transform again. So that's a beforeSave, using that to make modifications to properties in your entity before you commit it to a database. So let's now look at something else that we might want to do. We might want to send an email after we save, or after we mark a article as published. So we can do that using, again, our entity methods, and this time we're going to say we can get an array of all the different properties that have changed in the entity by using getDirty, but we can also do that individually. We can say if isDirty, a particular field, so published, and in this case I want to know if it's dirty, it's changing, but I also want to know that it's changing to be true. So I can say is dirty and it's true, then I want to send an email here. So now we're going to go into our first use of the event system outside of the default Cake callbacks that we've used right now, by using a mailer class. So an event enabled mailer class. So we can go bin cake bake a mailer. I'm going to call this the published mailer, and as I create that, we can see a directory is appearing underneath the src folder, and it's just a bare mailer class. Now the mailer, a parent class that the published mailer is inheriting from, as you can see, already implements the event listener interface. And if we have a look at that, this is what enables a class to listen for events raised in CakePHP. That event listener interface says you must implement this function in your class. Now here in the mailer class, it's returning an empty array, so basically saying there are no default events defined within the mailer class, but we can take that function and override it and create our own events. So we're going to create an article.published events. That's going to be the event name and how we'll refer to it. And then we can say, okay, so when that event is raised in this class, trigger this method. So if we go public function and article published, and you might notice from our before save and after save callbacks here that the first argument that will be received is always going to be the event argument. So we can say that is our first argument to this article published method. So this is a mailer class, so now we're going to look at just sending a mail from this block of code. So we're going to set the to be user at example, and we'll call that test user. And we want to set a subject for this email. A new article has been published, and we're not going to use templates or anything like that. We're just going to specify the content of the body here. So a new article has been published with a title of, and let's specify a title here. Okay, so we want to pass into our event here the article entity so that we can grab the title out of it. How do we do that? Well, here we have our code to say we want to send them email at this point. So we get hold of get the event manager, and then we create a dispatch method here, and it's expecting an event. So we create a new event. Now the event name that we're going to raise here and dispatch is article published. Now here the next argument is the subject. So we're going to pass it in the entity object, and that's all we need to do to pass the article through to the publish mailer. But how do we get the subject out of our event? So we do that by using the get subject method, and once we've done that, we can then, and maybe it's a good idea also to specify that that variable is an article, so that when we define our article variable further on in the code, it will auto-complete for us. So now we've gotten the subject out of our event and assigned it to a variable and referenced that. Let's have a look and see if this works as we expect. So now I'm just going to go edit, change it to published of our second article, so it's now flagged as published. And if we have a look here, it hasn't worked. Now why is that? Well, the problem is that yes, we've dispatched an event, but currently CakePHP has no idea, and specifically the event manager in the articles table has no idea about this mailer. So we need to inform the articles table class about this event available in the publish mailer. So to do that, we just go to somewhere like the initialize method or anywhere before we dispatch that event and do the following. So we go this get event manager and then specify on, and we say new, and we can just pass in our published mailer. Now what will the event manager do in here? Well, it will basically open this class, execute the implemented events function, and return to itself a list of different methods within the class that when this event is raised, this method will be triggered. And so now the articles table knows about these event methods available in the publish mailer. So now let's try that again within our front end. Let's do our published mailer here for the third article here, the new article there, and let's have a look and see if it's now worked, which it has. So that is using the event manager in the articles table to trigger an event in a mailer class. Now, let's talk a little bit about a challenge, and the documentation describes this well, where it shows us here, it says each model has a separate event manager and each view and controller share one. So if we're going to create some code that we might want to access all across the different models and controllers and fire events and have that code execute, if we use just the default event managers in each one of the models or controllers, what will happen is that we would have to do this hook wiring. Sorry, if I go back up to here, we'd have to do this wiring at the top of, so we'd have to go maybe into our controller and go to the initialize method in the controller and do the same thing and specify that multiple times. But we can get around that by using, as the documentation mentions, the global event manager. So let's create a global event listener and wire our global event manager to use it. So let's create a new folder call it event listeners, makes it obvious, and let's go global listener, and we just need to flesh out a global listener. Now our listeners always need to implement, we need to write that properly, event listener interface, that needs to do that. So public function, and we need to return an event list here. So here we have our very first global event listener. So public function global event, and as we said with all our event callbacks, they always have as the first argument the event is passed in. So we do need also to specify a namespace for this file as well. And just to show this working, we'll just dump and die when it's triggered. So there's our skeleton global event listener class. Now how do we wire this into CakePHP so it's available from everywhere? Go to your config file into Bootstrap. Here's a good place for it. Event manager, and we're going to use a static method called getInstance. Now this is going to return a singleton instance of the global event manager. It'll always be the same class it returns, and so we can now specify that this global event manager now has access to these events, and the methods will be executed when these events are raised. So let's raise this global event in, well, let's do it in a controller class here. We'll do it in the view. We'll just hit this view action to show it working. So instead of having to define this in the controller, we've already defined it globally. So we can get the event manager here and dispatch a new event. Just make sure that's pulled in, and it was a global dot event, and we don't need to do any more than that for the time being. But let's now hit that endpoint, and we can see that that global event has been raised from within the articles controller. Now if we go into the articles table, and maybe we can specify that same event from our after save method here. So again, going back to our article 2, just make a change, and we can see that after save, that global event is being triggered. Now this is how we define a global event. Let's have a look at passing arguments to these event listeners. Now, as it says in the function definition, the first argument in this event is the subject, and many times you might say you might want to pass the current class that you're in as the subject. But if you want to pass extra arguments, you then define a data array and give them meaningful names for what you're doing. So you might say, okay, I've got these commands and some extra data and this sort of stuff. And this can then be passed to the event. So you can pass in the subject and then some extra data here. Now, how do we access that? Well, let's have a look at this information as it's passed in. So within the event, we can say, okay, let's get the subject, which will give us that first argument passed to the second argument, sorry, passed to the event. Then we can say get the data, which will pass the array of data that we've specified. So let's look at that in practice. So we're here in our view class, we're dispatching the global event. The subject that we're passing in is the current class, which is the controller class, and then extra data is this. So let's have a look at that as we trigger our view action. So it'll dump and die. But notice that the subject is the controller, which we've passed in, and then we have our data that we've passed in as arguments. Now, one thing that the CakePHP event system does is this array, if you have a look at the event, the data array is also passed in as arguments to the callback method that we've defined for that event. So to show you that, let's go into here, and so we know that we've created a view variable and was it data? Can't remember now. Right. Now, these arguments are going to now be available on the command line. So if I now trigger that once more, so looking at them, you can see that we've now specified those as arguments. And we can get those things, if we want to get an individual argument out of the event, we can do that by specifying it by name and using get data as well. Or we can start to add these as extra arguments into our event function here. Now, I've given them the same name as the actual array here, but you can, sorry, I'm in the wrong spot there, go to global listener. You can name this anything you want. It's not tied to what you've specified, but it's a good idea obviously to make them consistent. So there we have, when we start to build our own events, we can pass in any number of arguments that we want and configure them on the command line. We have the ability to get hold of the subject or those extra arguments using the event itself as well. But this is obviously how the CakePHP internals are passing in an entity and an array of options as well, using this same sort of thing when it's raising an event. So that is raising an event with the global event manager. There is a problem if you use the global event manager that we're just going to cover now, and it says here, important thing you should consider is that there are events that will be triggered having the same name but different subjects. So checking it in the event object is required in any function that gets attached globally in order to prevent some bugs. So let's run into that bug ourselves. So firstly, here's our after save method within our articles table. How do we know the name of this particular event? We know that this is the callback function name here because we can see it, but what's the actual name of this event being raised? So let's dump and die our function, sorry, our event name here. So we go back to here, go to edit, we'll make a change to trigger the after save method, and notice that the name of this particular event is the model.afterSave event. So this particular event is model after save. Now the documentation says that if you define in a global event listener like this event, there may be issues. So let's have a look at that issue. Public function, and we'll call it global after save, and we certainly need to take the first argument. Will it be the event? And let's get the subject out of this event. Okay, so we just make sure, so we're going to trigger the after save event again, and this global listener is listening for this event, so it's going to dump and die when it's hit. So now I'm just going to try and hit the edit endpoint here, and let's just right, so notice here that I've just run into a challenge specified in the documentation, events triggered that have the same name but different subjects. So I've just pressed enter to go into my edit screen here for this article, and it's raised the model after save event with the subject of the panels table from debug kit. So this is where you may run into problems with your globally attached events. So in this case, what do we need to do? Well, we need to do some inspection. Now we know that this is an after save event and that the after save function definition is this. So let's just pop this here and just need to pull in these use statements at the top. So now we want to do some inspection. So the documentation that says that you'll need to do checking the event object subject. so a different subject. So we want to do some checking. So we can do if the event get subject is an instance of maybe the articles table, do the dump and die. So now if we go back here and do this and then trigger the after save event, notice that it now correctly will start doing something because it's seeing the right subject. Now we can also do something like, because this is an after save event and it's passing in the entity, we could do this same thing here, and we could say, look, if the entity is an instance of not an articles table but an article this time, then let's get the data and have a look at that. So again, trigger our save after save event, and then we can look at the article and do something with it. So that is getting around a problem with the global event manager, which means that the event, it could be generated anywhere in your application, but just specifying exactly what you want to act on if you need to do that. So there's just a gotcha with the global event manager that we work around. Now before I finish the video, just something about how we can specify multiple different events. So in our Bootstrap file we have this sort of layout here, but we can also sorry, just one moment while I Alright, so we can have a look at some code. This is some code from my a business application I wrote, and yeah, I'm not entirely proud of it all, but notice here that we have a way of doing this registration of global event listeners. We're just newing up the classes that we want to register globally, and then we're doing a for each loop. So that's one way of sort of not repeating yourself with using this global event manager. You can just put the classes into a loop, so to speak, and do that. Another option here, this is for inside a table object, is you just say, look, these are all the classes that I want to have listeners available in this particular table class. So I'll again do a loop through and do get event manager and new up the class however you'd like in a loop. Another thing here, we notice that we're not limited to just passing in a small amount of things. In this case, we're triggering this event in a remote class. We're passing it the entity that we're interested in, and then we're doing a whole heap of additional data being passed in. And notice here that I've defined a new event but assigned it to a variable, and what that means is I can dispatch the event, and then in the remote code I can then return a result. So let's have a look at that in code. So let's just do that now let's just do it in our controller here. And so we take our event out of the dispatch statement and just going to give that a variable, and then do this like this. And then in our global event listener, here is the global event. We're dumping and dying at the moment, but let's just imagine that I did some stuff and that at the end of it I said to myself, okay, set a result, and successfully did a global event, and I could return any number of things in this result. I could maybe, you know, create an array with some result stuff in it, with different stuff here, or here I'm just returning a string. I could return true or false or anything after triggering this event. But now that I've done this, we can now go back to our articles controller, we can trigger the event, and then we can say, okay, what was the result? Equals event get result. And in this case, we know we're returning a string. So that's all we need to do. And then I can do something here in my controller. So this flash, let's say success, whoop, and return the result to my calling class where I dispatch the event. So have a look here as we go back to, we're going to have to go back to our index page, and we know we've got to hit our view action here, so to trigger this event. Let's see if this works, and at the moment it doesn't, because I think I haven't saved our global listener yet. Let's try that one more time. Alright, so notice there that we triggered or dispatched our event within our controller, and then because we've got a reference to this event object, we can then get out of that after it's been dispatched the result, and then use that further along in our code, maybe to show success or whatever we'd like to do. So that's another thing that we need to think about when we're using our event system, returning results to the calling piece of code, and that's how you would do it. So this has been sort of a reasonably complex, I suppose, video, but I really hope that it's useful to someone.